The year is 476 CE, and the Western world holds its breath as the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a mere boy of perhaps 16 years, sits trembling on a throne that has lost all meaning, all power, all glory. Outside the palace walls, Germanic chieftain Odoacer marches with his warriors, not to conquer in the traditional sense, but to claim what Rome can no longer defend. And in this moment, one of history's greatest empires doesn't fall with thunder and lightning, but with a whimper, a quiet surrender that echoes across 15 centuries to our present day. What patterns emerge when we examine the death of empires? What common threads connect the fall of Rome to the decline of the British Empire? And should these patterns concern us as we watch modern America navigate the treacherous waters of the 21st century? The story of imperial collapse is not merely ancient history gathering dust in forgotten libraries. It is a living, breathing warning that speaks directly to our contemporary moment. And to understand where we might be heading, we must first understand where others have been, examining the sinews and bones of dead empires to diagnose the diseases that killed them. Rome did not fall in a day, contrary to popular imagination. The decline took centuries, a slow bleeding of vitality that began long before barbarian boots trampled the Forum, and the seeds of destruction were planted during the height of Roman power, during those golden centuries when emperors ruled from Britain to Mesopotamia, when Roman roads connected an empire larger than any the world had known, when Latin was the language of civilization and Roman citizenship the ultimate prize. The pattern begins with success itself, with the intoxication of absolute power and the hubris that whispers to every dominant civilization that their supremacy is eternal, divinely ordained, and utterly unshakable, a psychological trap that blinds leaders to gathering storms until too late. In the 2nd century CE, during the reign of the 5 good emperors, Rome reached its zenith of territorial expansion and cultural achievement. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, penned his meditations while defending the Danube frontier, never imagining that within 3 centuries his beloved Rome would be unrecognizable, its forums silent, its aqueducts crumbling, its legions disbanded or barbarized beyond recognition. But already the cracks were forming, hairline fractures in the imperial foundation that would widen into chasms capable of swallowing an entire civilization. The military, once Rome's greatest strength, began its transformation from citizen soldiers defending their homeland to professional armies more loyal to their generals than to the state, a subtle shift with catastrophic implications. The legions stationed on distant frontiers grew restless, cut off from Rome proper for years at a time, developing identities separate from the empire they supposedly served. Ambitious commanders saw opportunities for power in this restlessness, realizing that loyal troops could elevate them to purple, and the empire experienced its first taste of what would become chronic instability during the crisis of the 3rd century, when Rome cycled through 50 emperors in 50 years, most dying violently at the hands of rivals or their own troops, transforming imperial succession from orderly process to bloody lottery. Economic strain accompanied military chaos, the two feeding off each other in a vicious cycle that would repeat throughout imperial history. Maintaining legions across 3 continents required staggering resources, and Rome's solution was debasement of currency, mixing precious metals with cheaper alloys, inflation that eroded the savings of citizens and destabilized trade networks that had functioned smoothly for centuries, while taxation grew ever more burdensome on a shrinking base of productive citizens who found themselves crushed between barbarian raids and imperial tax collectors. The empire had expanded beyond its ability to efficiently govern. Communication from Rome to Britain took weeks under ideal conditions, months when weather intervened, meaning rebellions could fester and grow for extended periods before central authority even learned of them, by which time local crises had metastasized into regional catastrophes, and local governors wielded power that rivaled emperors, creating mini-empires within the empire, personal fiefdoms where imperial edicts were suggestions rather than commands. Social cohesion, that invisible glue binding diverse peoples into a unified Roman identity, began to dissolve like morning mist under the harsh sun of reality. The old republican virtues of duty, sacrifice, and civic participation gave way to cynicism, corruption, and the pursuit of personal wealth and pleasure, as Romans increasingly asked not what they could do for Rome, but what Rome could do for them. A fundamental shift in mentality that hollowed out the empire from within. The bread and circuses that kept the masses content grew more elaborate and expensive, distracting from fundamental problems rather than solving them, creating a population dependent on state handouts and entertainment rather than productive work. While the wealthy elite withdrew into fortified villas, creating parallel societies disconnected from the struggles of common people, insulated by walls and private armies from the chaos consuming the world beyond their estates. Christianity's rise, while bringing spiritual renewal to millions, also fractured the shared pagan traditions that had united the empire for centuries, and theological disputes became political battles that divided cities and provinces, with Arians fighting Athanasians, Donatists clashing with Catholics, and imperial resources squandered on enforcing religious orthodoxy while barbarians pressed the frontiers. The conversion of Constantine in 312 CE might have strengthened the empire by providing new ideological foundation, but instead it introduced new fault lines that proved as divisive as they were unifying. Immigration and integration challenged Roman identity in ways that Romans struggled to comprehend or address. Barbarian tribes, initially allowed to settle in frontier regions as federates who would defend borders in exchange for land, retained their own customs, languages, and loyalties, creating a patchwork of peoples who called themselves Roman but felt little attachment to Rome itself, their allegiance conditional and temporary rather than the deep identification that had characterized. The military became increasingly barbarized, with Germanic warriors filling the ranks and even rising to command positions, until the very institution meant to defend Rome was staffed by those Rome had once conquered. By the 5th century, the distinction between Roman and barbarian had blurred to meaninglessness, with barbarian generals like Stilicho defending Rome against other barbarians, and the question arose whether Rome was defending itself or merely hosting conflicts between various Germanic peoples. The provinces, once proud to be part of the Roman world, began to see imperial rule as burden rather than blessing. Britain, Gaul, Spain, and Africa contributed taxes and troops but received less and less protection in return, as emperors focused on Italy and the wealthy eastern provinces, leading to resentment and the growth of separatist sentiment, the feeling that provincial populations would be better off governing themselves, or at least cutting deals with local barbarian groups rather than depending on distant Rome. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE marked a turning point from which Rome never recovered. The Gothic cavalry destroyed a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens, demonstrating that barbarians could not only raid but defeat Rome in open battle, shattering the myth of Roman invincibility that had kept enemies in check through psychological intimidation as much as military might. And after Adrianople, the floodgates opened as tribe after tribe realized Rome was vulnerable. Theodosius, the last emperor to rule both East and West, died in 395 CE, and his division of the empire between his sons Arcadius and Honorius created an administrative split that quickly became cultural and political, with the Greek-speaking East and Latin-speaking West developing separate identities, pursuing different policies, and increasingly viewing each other as foreign rather than fraternal. The East, richer and more defensible, would survive as Byzantium for another 1,000 years. But the West spiraled toward oblivion with shocking speed. The sack of Rome by Visigoths under Alaric in 410 CE sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean world. Rome, unconquered for 800 years, fell to barbarian pillage, and though Alaric's sack was relatively restrained and brief, the psychological impact was devastating, forcing Romans to confront the mortality of their civilization. And St. Augustine wrote City of God partly to address the crisis of faith among Christians who wondered why God permitted Rome's humiliation. Britain, that remote province at the empire's edge, was abandoned in 410 CE when Emperor Honorius, besieged in Ravenna and unable to help, sent a remarkable letter telling the Britons to see to their own defense, effectively cutting them loose from empire. The Romano-British population, accustomed to imperial protection, now faced Saxon and Pictish raids alone, and within generations Roman civilization in Britain had collapsed into the Dark Ages, with cities abandoned, literacy lost, and Christianity nearly extinguished, a preview of what awaited other provinces. Gaul fragmented as Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks carved out kingdoms, sometimes as nominal federates of Rome, but increasingly as independent powers who paid lip service to imperial authority while acting autonomously. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa in 429 CE under Gaiseric, seizing Rome's breadbasket and richest provinces, and by 439 CE they controlled Carthage and its vital grain shipments to Italy, strangling Rome economically while building a pirate fleet that raided Italian coasts with impunity. The Western Empire had become a rump state, controlling little beyond Italy itself, dependent on barbarian generals for military force, and even Italy was not secure, as Attila the Hun's invasion in 452 CE demonstrated when his armies ravaged the Po Valley until Pope Leo I personally negotiated his withdrawal. The image of the Pope, not the Emperor, saving Rome symbolized the transfer of authority from secular to religious leadership, a shift that would define medieval Europe. The Vandal sack of Rome in 455 CE was more thorough than Alaric's, with Gaiseric's warriors spending 2 weeks systematically looting the city, stripping it of treasures accumulated over centuries. And though they avoided the mass slaughter and burning that would characterize later sacks, they carried off so much wealth and so many captives, including the Empress and her daughters, that Rome was left a hollow shell. The Western emperors who followed were shadows, powerless figureheads, manipulated by barbarian kingmakers, ruling territories that shrank with each passing year. Ricimer, a barbarian general of Suevic and Visigothic descent, served as the real power behind multiple puppet emperors from 456 to 472 CE, making and unmaking emperors at will, and after his death, his successor Gundobad continued the pattern until Orestes, another barbarian general, seized power in 475 CE and placed his young son Romulus Augustulus on the throne. The boy bore the names of Rome's founder and first emperor, a cosmic irony given that he would be the last, and when Odoacer deposed him in 476 CE, the Germanic chieftain didn't bother claiming the imperial title, instead sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruling Italy as king, implicitly acknowledging that the Western Empire had ceased to exist. The date 476 CE is convenient for historians marking Rome's fall, but the reality was less clear-cut. Contemporaries barely noticed the change, life continued much as before, and in the Eastern Empire, emperors still claimed authority over the West for centuries, even attempting reconquest under Justinian in the 6th century. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The Roman Empire as a Western political entity was gone, replaced by a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms that would slowly evolve into medieval Europe. What killed Rome? The question has obsessed historians for 15 centuries, generating countless theories from moral decay to lead poisoning, from Christianity to climate change. But the most convincing answer is that Rome died from a combination of interrelated factors that reinforced each other until the system collapsed. No single cause was sufficient, but together they created a cascade of failures that overwhelmed even Rome's legendary resilience. The military crisis stemmed from Rome's inability to recruit sufficient quality troops from citizen populations that had declined and grown soft, forcing reliance on barbarian federates whose loyalty was questionable. The economic crisis resulted from inflation, taxation, declining trade, and loss of productive provinces. The political crisis emerged from the failure to establish legitimate succession mechanisms, leading to constant civil wars. The social crisis reflected the breakdown of shared identity and values that had united the empire. And the strategic crisis arose from simultaneous threats on multiple frontiers that exceeded Rome's capacity to respond. Each crisis exacerbated the others in a vicious cycle. Military weakness invited more attacks, requiring higher taxes which damaged the economy, provoking social unrest, which distracted from external threats, which required more military spending, which further strained the economy, and so the spiral continued until collapse became inevitable, demonstrating that empires are complex systems where individual problems can create cascading failures that overwhelm the entire structure. Yet even in death, Rome's ghost haunted Europe for over 1,000 years. Every subsequent power aspired to reclaim Roman glory, from Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire to Mussolini's fascist dreams, because Rome represented the pinnacle of Western achievement, the standard against which all others measured themselves, the proof that civilization could triumph over barbarism, that law could govern instead of force, that a single state could unite diverse peoples in peace and prosperity. The lessons of Rome's fall were studied endlessly, debated by scholars, analyzed by statesmen, and apparently forgotten by each new empire that rose to prominence, including the next great imperial power we must examine, the British Empire, which at its height in the early 20th century ruled a quarter of the world's population and territory, creating the largest empire in human history, dwarfing even Rome at its greatest extent. Britain's rise seems almost accidental when examined closely, emerging from a small, rainy island on Europe's periphery, lacking the resources and population of continental powers, yet somehow managing to dominate global trade, politics, and culture for 2 centuries. And the question of how Britain achieved this remarkable feat is almost as interesting as the question of why it ultimately failed. Britain's imperial journey began modestly in the 17th century with trading companies seeking profit in distant lands rather than territorial conquest. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, established footholds in the Indian subcontinent primarily to trade spices, textiles, and tea, while Caribbean plantations generated wealth from sugar and slave labor, and North American colonies provided raw materials for British industry, all driven by commercial rather than imperial motives. Initially, the loss of the American colonies in 1783 might have ended British imperial ambitions, teaching the lesson that empire was expensive and ungovernable, but instead it catalyzed a shift toward Asia and Africa, with British attention turning from settlement colonies to trading posts and resource extraction. And by the early 19th century, Britain had become the world's preeminent naval power, using its fleet to protect trade routes, suppress piracy and slavery, and project power globally. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, transformed the economic basis of empire. British factories produced textiles, iron, steel, and machinery more efficiently than any competitors, creating manufactured goods that flooded world markets, while British capital financed railways, mines, and infrastructure projects across continents, and British merchants controlled much of global trade, even in regions not formally part of the empire, establishing economic dominance that made political control almost unnecessary in some areas. The Napoleonic Wars, paradoxically, strengthened British imperial position despite their immense cost. Britain bankrolled coalitions against France, maintained naval supremacy that strangled French trade, and emerged from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 as the dominant global power, with France defeated, Spain and Portugal declining, and no serious rivals remaining, creating a brief unipolar moment of British hegemony. The Victorian era, named for Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, represented the peak of British power and confidence. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace in London, showcased British industrial might and attracted millions of visitors to see the wonders of modern technology. While British explorers mapped Africa, British scientists made groundbreaking discoveries, British engineers built railways across continents, and British missionaries spread Christianity and Western values, all contributing to a sense of civilizing mission that justified imperial expansion. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, known to Britons as the Sepoy Mutiny, proved a watershed moment, sparked by religious insensitivities and fears of forced conversion. The rebellion saw Indian soldiers turn on their British officers and slaughter European civilians, leading to brutal British retaliation and the massacre of thousands, and though Britain ultimately suppressed the rebellion, it exposed the fragility of imperial control and led to the dissolution of the East India Company and direct crown rule over India, formalizing what had been de facto control. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw Britain compete with France, Germany, and other European powers to claim territories across the continent. Britain secured Egypt to control the Suez Canal. Britain expanded in southern Africa seeking gold and diamonds. Britain claimed vast territories in East and West Africa, and by 1914, British possessions covered roughly a quarter of the world's land surface, colored pink on maps that decorated schoolrooms across the empire, teaching British children that their nation was uniquely destined to rule. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 celebrated 60 years of her reign and the zenith of British imperial power. The festivities included a massive military parade featuring troops from across the empire, Indian princes in elephant-drawn carriages, Canadian Mounties, Australian cavalry, African soldiers, and representatives from every corner of the globe. A spectacular display meant to demonstrate that the sun never set on the British Empire and never would. That British power was eternal and unassailable, blessed by God and secured by the Royal Navy. But even at this moment of maximum triumph, the seeds of decline were germinating, invisible to celebrants but clear to retrospective analysis. The very success that bred confidence also bred complacency and overextension, the assumption that dominance was natural and permanent rather than contingent and temporary, and the failure to recognize that British power rested on temporary advantages that competitors would eventually match or surpass. Britain's empire, unlike Rome's contiguous territories, was scattered across every continent and ocean, connected by sea lanes that were vulnerable to disruption and required constant naval presence to protect, while the territories themselves required military garrisons, administrative personnel, and infrastructure investments that consumed enormous resources. The costs of empire, both financial and human, grew exponentially even as the benefits became less clear, especially to British workers, who saw little connection between imperial glory and their own grinding poverty. The Boer War from 1899 to 1902 fought against Dutch settlers in South Africa over control of gold and diamond resources, revealed unexpected weaknesses. The Boers, though vastly outnumbered, fought a brilliant guerrilla campaign that humiliated British forces repeatedly, and though Britain ultimately won by herding Boer civilians into concentration camps where thousands died of disease and neglect, the victory was Pyrrhic, costing Britain international condemnation, vast sums of money, and the realization that even small determined opponents could resist imperial might. Britain's industrial supremacy, the foundation of its wealth and power, faced mounting challenges from emerging competitors, particularly Germany and the United States, whose newer factories incorporated more advanced technologies and whose economies grew faster than Britain's, eroding the productivity advantage that had funded naval dominance and imperial expansion. By 1900, both Germany and America produced more steel than Britain, and by 1914, both had larger economies, though Britain remained wealthier per capita due to accumulated capital and imperial resources. The arms race with Germany in the decade before World War I consumed enormous resources as Britain tried to maintain naval supremacy through dreadnought battleship construction, while simultaneously facing nationalist movements in Ireland and India, labor unrest at home as workers demanded better conditions, and the suffragette movement challenging male political monopoly. Britain in 1914 was powerful but strained, confident but anxious, dominant but defensive, sensing that the world was changing in ways that threatened comfortable assumptions. The First World War, which Britain entered in August 1914 to maintain the balance of power in Europe and protect Belgium, proved devastatingly costly in ways that shattered Victorian certainties. Nearly 1 million British soldiers died, mostly young men from working and middle classes, lost in the mud of Flanders or at Gallipoli or in dozens of other battles that accomplished little, while the war cost over £40 billion, requiring Britain to liquidate overseas investments, borrow massively from America, and inflate its currency. The war shattered the illusion that modern civilization meant progress toward peace and rationality. Poison gas, machine guns, tanks, submarines, and aerial bombardment demonstrated that technology could destroy as easily as create, that Western civilization could turn its industrial might toward unprecedented slaughter, and the survivors returned traumatized, disillusioned, and unwilling to accept the social hierarchies and imperial certainties that had sent them to die for minimal territory. The Russian Revolution in 1917 and the Bolshevik consolidation of power offered an alternative model that challenged British and Western values. Communism promised workers' liberation, criticized imperialism as capitalist exploitation, and inspired revolutionary movements worldwide, forcing Britain to confront not just military threats but ideological challenges to the legitimacy of empire itself. The interwar period from 1919 to 1939 saw the first major cracks in imperial control becoming visible to anyone willing to look. Ireland won independence after a brutal guerrilla war from 1919 to 1921, forcing Britain to accept partition and the creation of the Irish Free State, the first time a white dominion had broken away, setting a precedent that worried imperial administrators. India's nationalist movement, led by Mohandas Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, gained strength through campaigns of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience that put Britain in an impossible position. Brutal repression would contradict British claims to represent civilization and democracy, yet allowing Indian autonomy would undermine imperial control, and Gandhi's genius lay in forcing Britain to choose between its values and its interests, demonstrating that they were incompatible. Egypt, though technically independent since 1922, remained under British influence through military presence and control of the Suez Canal, but nationalist sentiment grew stronger with each passing year, and similar movements emerged across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, wherever British rule confronted populations increasingly aware of concepts like self-determination and national sovereignty. The economic depression following the 1929 stock market crash hit Britain hard, with unemployment reaching over 20% in industrial regions, exports collapsing, and the pound sterling forced off the gold standard in 1931, symbolizing the decline of British financial dominance. Britain's response included protective tariffs that fragmented the global trading system and contributed to the international tensions that would lead to another world war. The rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, and Japan presented Britain with security challenges it lacked resources to meet. Britain could no longer defend its interests simultaneously in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, forcing agonizing choices about priorities, and the policy of appeasement, criticized harshly in retrospect, reflected Britain's awareness of its own weakness and desperation to avoid another devastating war. The Second World War, beginning in September 1939 when Britain declared war on Germany after its invasion of Poland, initially went disastrously. France fell in 6 weeks, British forces evacuated from Dunkirk, the Blitz terrorized British cities, and by 1941 Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, dependent on American aid to survive and facing possible invasion, a humbling experience for a nation accustomed to ruling waves rather than being threatened across them. Winston Churchill's leadership during Britain's darkest hour was magnificent, rallying the nation through speeches that promised nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. But beneath the rhetoric lay the reality that Britain was fighting for survival, not dominance, and that victory would require alliances with powers, America and the Soviet Union, who would emerge from the war stronger than Britain. Churchill recognized this, famously quipping that he had not become prime minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, yet that is precisely what he and his successors would do. The entry of America into the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941 guaranteed eventual victory, but also guaranteed American dominance of the post-war order. Britain received massive American aid through Lend-Lease, but at the cost of accepting American conditions that included dismantling imperial preference systems and supporting self-determination for colonized peoples. And by 1945, Britain was financially exhausted, deeply in debt to America, and unable to maintain military forces sufficient for imperial control. The war's end in 1945 found Britain nominally victorious, one of the big three alongside America and the Soviet Union, holding a permanent seat on the new United Nations Security Council. Yet the reality beneath the surface was that Britain was broke, exhausted, and unable to maintain its empire without American support that would not be forthcoming for imperial ventures. The empire that had taken centuries to build would be dismantled in less than 3 decades. One of history's most rapid. Imperial collapses. India's independence in 1947, the jewel in the crown breaking away, signaled the beginning of rapid decolonization. Britain simply lacked the resources and will to hold India against determined nationalist resistance, and the partition that accompanied independence, creating Pakistan and triggering communal violence that killed perhaps 1 million people and displaced 12 million more, demonstrated the chaos that imperial withdrawal could unleash. Yet Britain had no choice but to accept what could no longer prevent. Palestine, mandated to Britain after World War I, became an impossible problem as Zionist immigration conflicted with Arab nationalism, and Britain, unable to satisfy either side and facing Jewish terrorism and Arab resistance, simply gave up, handing the mandate to the United Nations in 1947 and withdrawing, leaving Jews and Arabs to fight it out in the war that would create Israel. This ignominious retreat from Palestine symbolized Britain's inability to manage conflicts it had helped create. Burma and Ceylon gained independence in 1948, followed by Malaya after Britain defeated a communist insurgency, and the pattern accelerated throughout the 1950s and 1960s as colony after colony gained independence, sometimes peacefully through negotiation, often amid violence as in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising where Britain committed atrocities trying to suppress insurgency, or in Cyprus where Greek and Turkish communities fought each other and Britain, or in Aden where British forces fought a losing counterinsurgency before withdrawing in 1967. The Suez Crisis of 1956 provided the definitive proof of Britain's diminished status and marked the psychological moment when Britain accepted it was no longer a great power. When Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France, in secret coordination with Israel, launched a military operation to retake it, and the operation succeeded militarily, with British and French forces occupying the canal zone. But American President Eisenhower, furious at not being consulted and fearing Soviet intervention, applied devastating economic pressure, threatening to destroy the pound sterling, forcing Britain to withdraw in humiliation. The Suez debacle demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as an independent great power without American approval, that the special relationship between Britain and America was patron-client rather than partnership between equals, and that the age of European empires was over, replaced by a bipolar world where America and the Soviet Union were superpowers and everyone else, including Britain, played supporting roles. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace, broken by the crisis, while Britain's international prestige never recovered. Harold Macmillan, who became Prime Minister after Eden, acknowledged reality in his famous Wind of Change speech in 1960, delivered to the South African Parliament, where he noted that a wind of change was blowing through Africa and that Britain would support African nationalism rather than resist it. This marked official acceptance of decolonization as policy rather than failure, reframing imperial retreat as principled support for self-determination, though the reality was that Britain had no choice. The 1960s saw African colonies gain independence rapidly. Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, and many others, some peacefully, some after violence, but all following the same pattern of British withdrawal from territories it could no longer afford or justify holding. And by 1970, most of the empire was gone, reduced to scattered territories like Hong Kong, Gibraltar, the Falklands, and various small islands that either wanted to remain British or were too small to be viable independent states. Britain's application to join the European Economic Community, vetoed by French President Charles de Gaulle in 1963 and again in 1967, symbolized the search for a new role now that empire was gone. Britain, having stood apart from European integration while maintaining global empire, now sought to join Europe precisely because the empire had disappeared, but de Gaulle, remembering British aloofness and suspecting Britain remained too attached to America, blocked entry until after his retirement, and Britain finally joined in 1973, an irony given that Britain would vote to leave again in 2016. The 1970s were arguably Britain's lowest point. The economy stagnated with high inflation and unemployment simultaneously. Labor strikes paralyzed industries. The winter of discontent in 1978 to 1979 saw garbage piling in streets and bodies unburied as workers struck, and Britain was widely perceived as the sick man of Europe, a once great power declining into irrelevance, unable to manage its economy or society, a cautionary tale of imperial decline. Margaret Thatcher's election as Prime Minister in 1979 began a transformation that arrested decline, though at significant social cost. Her policies broke union power, privatized state industries, deregulated finance, and shifted Britain's economy from manufacturing to services, particularly financial services centered in London. And while this created new prosperity, it also increased inequality and accelerated the destruction of traditional working-class communities dependent on manufacturing. The Falklands War in 1982, when Argentina seized these remote South Atlantic islands and Britain sent a task force 8,000 miles to retake them, provided a brief revival of imperial nostalgia and national pride. But it was a small war against a third-rate military dictatorship, not a demonstration of great power status, more like a final twitch of imperial muscle memory than genuine revival of British power. Hong Kong's return to China in 1997, mandated by treaty but symbolically devastating, marked the end of meaningful British Empire. The colony that had prospered under British rule for over a century and a half was handed back to Communist China in elaborate ceremonies that included Prince Charles reading a speech while rain poured down. A pathetic fallacy if ever there was one, and Britain's last significant overseas possession was gone, leaving only scattered remnants too small to matter. Geographically, though sometimes prosperous economically, Britain today remains a significant power, a nuclear-armed Permanent Security Council member, a financial center, a cultural exporter through its language, universities, and media, but it is not an empire and not a superpower, and the search for identity and purpose after empire has proven difficult, manifesting in debates about Britain's role in Europe, its special relationship with America, and its place in a multipolar world where it is one important voice among many rather than the dominant. Power-shaping events. What patterns connect Rome's fall and Britain's decline, separated by 15 centuries yet remarkably similar in their trajectories? First and most obviously, military overextension. Both Rome and Britain attempted to maintain security across vast territories, stretching their military resources beyond sustainable limits, creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit, and while Rome's overextension was geographical, with frontiers that required more troops than it could recruit, Britain's was logistical, with scattered possessions connected by sea lanes vulnerable to disruption by submarine or rival navy. Rome's legions faced simultaneous threats on multiple frontiers, forcing impossible choices about where to concentrate forces, whether to defend Gaul or the Danube or Syria, each equally vital and each undermanned. Britain's forces faced similar dilemmas, unable to simultaneously defend India, the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific against determined challenges, as World War II painfully demonstrated when Japan's attacks forced the loss of Singapore and threatened India while Britain fought in North Africa and Europe. Second, economic decline relative to competitors. Rome's economy stagnated while barbarian kingdoms developed economic capabilities, losing the productivity advantage that had funded military superiority and made Roman goods desirable across the known world. Britain's early industrial lead evaporated as other nations industrialized using newer technologies and more efficient methods, ending the economic dominance that had enabled empire and made British goods ubiquitous globally. Rome's currency debasement and inflation eroded economic stability while failing to generate sufficient revenue for imperial defense. Britain's loss of gold standard in 1931 and post-war dollar shortages symbolized similar monetary decline, the pound sterling falling from global reserve currency to one among several, a humiliation for a nation whose currency had once been as good as gold. Third, loss of political cohesion and shared purpose. Rome's transformation from republic to empire, from citizen soldiers defending their homeland to professional armies fighting for pay and commanders fighting for power, from shared pagan identity to fractured Christian sects, eroded the common cause that united Romans across their vast territories. Britain's class divisions, growing ever more rigid despite rhetoric of common purpose, the disconnect between imperial administrators living comfortably abroad and working-class Britons struggling at home, and the cognitive dissonance between democratic values proclaimed domestically and authoritarian rule exercised colonially undermined national unity. Rome's provinces increasingly questioned why they should support an empire that seemed to benefit Italy at their expense. Britain's colonial subjects increasingly rejected the racial hierarchies and civilizing mission rhetoric that justified British rule, recognizing it as naked exploitation dressed in moral language, and demanding self-determination that British values proclaimed but British interests denied. Fourth, the rise of powerful challengers. Rome faced Germanic tribes who learned Roman military techniques through service in Roman armies and ultimately turned them against their teachers, proving that cultural transmission works both ways and that military advantages are temporary. Britain confronted rising industrial powers, particularly Germany and the United States, who learned from British innovations, surpassed British capabilities in key industries, and challenged British dominance economically before challenging it militarily. Rome's barbarians were initially considered inferior peoples, useful as soldiers but not threatening to Roman supremacy, until suddenly they were conquering Roman provinces and deposing emperors. Britain's colonized peoples were similarly dismissed as inferior races requiring British guidance, until nationalist movements demonstrated that subject peoples could organize effective resistance and make empire unsustainable, that moral authority matters and Britain lacked it when fighting peoples, demanding freedoms Britain claimed to champion. Fifth, fiscal crisis driven by unsustainable commitments. Rome's military consumed ever larger portions of imperial revenue, requiring taxation that damaged the economy it was meant to protect, creating a vicious cycle where economic decline reduced revenue, requiring higher tax rates, which further damaged the economy, while expenditures kept rising. Britain's military and imperial administration similarly consumed resources that might have been invested in education, infrastructure, or industrial modernization, and after 1945, Britain faced impossible choices between maintaining empire, rebuilding war-damaged industries and cities, and creating the welfare state that British citizens demanded after their wartime sacrifices. Sixth, erosion of cultural confidence. Romans lost faith in their civilizing mission and traditional values, questioning whether empire was worth the cost, whether Roman culture was superior to barbarian simplicity, whether the gods favored Rome or had abandoned it, leading to internal decay and acceptance of decline as inevitable. Britons questioned the morality of empire, the costs of maintaining it, whether racial hierarchy could be justified, whether forcing British culture on unwilling populations was civilizing mission or cultural imperialism, and whether imperial glory justified the sacrifices required of working-class soldiers and colonial subjects. Rome's cultural decay manifested in declining educational standards, loss of classical learning, breakdown of infrastructure, and preference for immediate gratification over long-term investment. Britain's cultural confusion manifested in post-imperial identity crisis, loss of sense of national purpose, and decline from cultural exporter shaping global norms to cultural participant among many. Seventh, the inability to adapt institutions designed for earlier circumstances to changed realities. Rome's governmental structures, adequate for a city-state or even a Mediterranean empire, broke down under the strain of transcontinental rule requiring communications infrastructure and administrative depth that didn't exist. Britain's Victorian-era imperial administration, effective when facing technologically inferior opponents who lacked nationalist ideology, could not cope with modern nationalism and global competition where subject peoples could appeal to international opinion and organize sustained resistance. Rome never solved the succession problem, never established legitimate mechanisms for transferring power, instead relying on military force and Senate approval that meant nothing when legions could make their own emperors. Britain never solved the colonial problem, never created institutions that gave subject peoples meaningful participation while maintaining imperial unity, instead oscillating between authoritarian rule and grudging concessions until the whole structure collapsed. Rome's bureaucracy grew increasingly corrupt and inefficient as central authority weakened. Britain's colonial administration grew increasingly disconnected from both London policymakers and local populations, creating neither effective governance nor local legitimacy, merely extracting resources and suppressing dissent until costs exceeded benefits. These 7 patterns, military overextension, relative economic decline, loss of cohesion and purpose, rise of challengers, fiscal crisis, erosion of cultural confidence, and institutional rigidity, repeat across empires because they reflect fundamental dynamics of how dominance works and how it fails, not random historical accidents but structural problems inherent in imperial systems that manifest regardless of specific cultural or technological contexts. The question that haunts contemporary America is whether these patterns are emerging here, whether the United States, sole superpower after the Cold War, globally dominant in military, economic, and cultural spheres, is following the trajectory that destroyed Rome and diminished Britain, or whether American exceptionalism is real, making America immune to historical patterns that claimed every previous empire. To address this question requires first acknowledging America's imperial status, though Americans resist the label empire with visceral distaste rooted in founding mythology and self-image. America was born in anti-colonial revolution, defined itself against European imperialism, proclaimed principles of liberty and self-determination. So thinking of America as empire feels like betrayal of founding values, yet viewed objectively from outside, American global position looks remarkably imperial. Despite different rhetoric and methods, America maintains military bases in over 70 countries, more than any previous empire including Britain at its peak. American troops are stationed permanently in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, providing security, projecting power, and enabling rapid intervention anywhere globally. This presence is sometimes welcomed by host nations, sometimes resented, but it is undeniably imperial in scope and function, creating the infrastructure for American military dominance. America's military budget exceeds the next 10 countries combined, and American technological superiority in areas like aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, stealth aircraft, and precision munitions gives it capabilities no other nation can match. The United States Navy patrols every ocean, enforcing freedom of navigation, protecting trade routes, and intervening in regional disputes, precisely the role Britain's Royal Navy played in the 19th century, proving that some imperial functions remain constant regardless of who performs them. America dominates international financial institutions created after World War II under American leadership, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and later the World Trade Organization all reflect American economic power and promote American economic interests and values like free trade, capital mobility, and property rights. The dollar's status as global reserve currency gives America extraordinary economic advantages and leverage, allowing it to print money that the world accepts, sanction other countries by excluding them from dollar-denominated transactions, and run trade deficits that would destroy other nations' currencies. American cultural exports dominate globally. Hollywood films, American music, American television shows, American fast food, American brands, American internet platforms, and American English as global lingua franca all represent soft power that shapes how billions of people understand the world, what they aspire to, and what they consume, cultural influence that rivals or exceeds anything Rome or Britain achieved. American military interventions since World War II have shaped politics in dozens of countries: Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq twice, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and many smaller operations demonstrate willingness to use force to shape outcomes, sometimes successfully as in Grenada or the First Gulf War, sometimes disastrously as in Vietnam or the Second Iraq War, but always reflecting the imperial reality that America considers itself responsible for global order and entitled to intervene when interests or values are threatened. America's alliance networks, NATO in Europe, bilateral treaties with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and others in Asia, the Rio Pact in Latin America, create a hub-and-spoke system with America at the center, analogous to how Rome's client kingdoms and Britain's treaty relationships extended influence beyond direct control. And these alliances bring obligations and entanglements that limit American freedom of action while extending American power. The American empire differs from Rome and Britain in important ways. America does not seek territorial annexation, does not extract tribute directly, does not create formal colonial administrations, and promotes, at least rhetorically, the independence and sovereignty of other states, operating more through economic integration, military protection, and cultural influence than direct rule. Yet the effects are often imperial, with American preferences shaping other nations' policies as surely as Roman governors or British colonial administrators once did. America's rise to this imperial position was neither planned nor desired by the Founding Fathers, who warned explicitly against foreign entanglements and standing armies, fearing that empire abroad would corrupt democracy at home, that maintaining military power would require taxation and centralization antithetical to republican virtue, and that alliances would drag America into European wars that served no American interest. George Washington's farewell address in 1796 cautioned against permanent alliances and urged America to take advantage of its detached situation to avoid European conflicts, advice that shaped American foreign policy for over a century. Thomas Jefferson spoke of an empire of liberty that would spread through example and voluntary adoption rather than force, envisioning American values radiating outward as other peoples recognized their superiority and chose to emulate them. A fundamentally different conception than military empire. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled American territory but was justified as providing land for yeoman farmers, the backbone of Jeffersonian democracy, rather than imperial expansion, though. Native Americans displaced by westward expansion might have questioned this distinction. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 initially sought to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere rather than project American power globally, warning European nations against new colonization or intervention in the Americas while pledging American non-interference in European affairs, creating a sphere of influence that was defensive rather than aggressive in conception, though it would later justify American interventions throughout Latin America. This doctrine reflected the American self-image as fundamentally different from European empires, protecting freedom rather than suppressing it, yet the practical effect was establishing American dominance over an entire hemisphere. Manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand across the North American continent, drove westward expansion throughout the 19th century, resulting in war with Mexico that seized half its territory, displacement and genocide of Native American peoples, and continental empire stretching from Atlantic to Pacific. This expansion was rationalized as spreading democracy and civilization, bringing backward peoples into modernity, language identical to European imperial rhetoric, yet Americans convinced themselves it was fundamentally different because American values were universal and beneficent rather than exploitative. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a crucial turning point when America acquired overseas territories and entered the imperial game explicitly. The war began ostensibly to liberate Cuba from Spanish oppression, supported by sensationalist yellow journalism that inflamed public opinion with reports of Spanish atrocities, real and imagined, but it resulted in America acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, territories that would never become states, populated by peoples who would never be citizens with full rights, creating the colonial relationships that America had supposedly rejected. The debate over Philippine annexation revealed deep divisions in American self-understanding. Anti-imperialists like Mark Twain, William James, and Andrew Carnegie argued passionately that overseas empire betrayed everything America stood for, that governing people without their consent contradicted the Declaration of Independence, that empire would corrupt American democracy as it had corrupted Rome, requiring standing armies, high taxes, and executive power that threatened liberty. Imperialists like Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and Alfred Thayer Mahan countered that great nations must accept the responsibilities of power, that America had a duty to uplift backward peoples, that naval bases in the Pacific were necessary for commerce and security, and that refusing empire would leave a vacuum that other powers would fill to America's detriment. President William McKinley justified annexation by claiming divine guidance, stating that after praying for wisdom, he concluded that America must take the Philippines to educate, uplift, civilize, and Christianize the Filipinos. Apparently unaware that most Filipinos were already Catholic, a revealing ignorance that typified imperial arrogance. The subsequent Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902 killed perhaps 200,000 Filipinos. Many civilians, as American forces suppressed independence fighters using tactics including concentration camps, torture, and village burning, demonstrating that American imperialism could be as brutal as European varieties despite different rhetoric. Theodore Roosevelt exemplified the imperial turn in American foreign policy. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he helped provoke war with Spain. As Rough Rider, he became war hero. As president from 1901 to 1909, he wielded American power aggressively, engineering Panama's secession from Colombia to build a canal under American control, proclaiming a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine asserting American right to intervene in Latin American countries to maintain order, sending the Great White Fleet around the world to demonstrate American naval power, and mediating international disputes like the Russo-Japanese War, behavior that made America a great power but contradicted founding principles of non-intervention and Republican modesty. World War I brought America onto the world stage despite initial neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed American neutrality, maintaining that European wars were not American concern, but German submarine warfare, British propaganda, and American economic ties to the Allies gradually pushed America toward intervention, and in April 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war to make the world safe for democracy, framing American entry in idealistic terms that distinguished it from European power politics. Wilson's 14 Points and League of Nations proposal represented attempts to create a new international order based on self-determination, collective security, and international law rather than imperial competition. Yet the Senate's rejection of the League demonstrated continuing ambivalence about America's global role. The interwar period saw America retreat from global leadership, rejecting Wilson's vision in favor of isolationism that left Europe and Asia to manage their own affairs while America enjoyed prosperity. This retreat proved disastrous as the global order collapsed into depression and fascism, demonstrating that great powers cannot simply opt out of global responsibilities without consequences, yet it reflected genuine American preference for focusing on domestic affairs rather than bearing burdens of global leadership. World War II transformed America permanently from regional power to global hegemon, a change neither planned nor desired but ultimately accepted as necessary. America entered the war only after Pearl Harbor, fighting primarily to defend itself rather than shape the world, yet emerged in 1945 with Europe and Asia devastated, the British Empire collapsing, the Soviet Union exhausted despite victory, and only America possessing intact industry, overwhelming military power, nuclear weapons, monopoly, and capital to rebuild, creating a unipolar moment where American leadership was essential simply because no one else could provide it. The decision to accept global leadership rather than retreat into isolationism as after World War I reflected lessons learned from that earlier retreat, recognition that American security and prosperity required stable international order that only America could guarantee, and willingness to bear costs of leadership to prevent another collapse into depression and war. The Marshall Plan providing billions to rebuild Europe, the creation of NATO as permanent alliance, the occupation and reconstruction of Japan and Germany, the Bretton Woods system establishing dollar-based international finance, and the United Nations headquartered in New York all represented American commitment to global order that would have shocked the founders. The Cold War institutionalized American global presence for 45 years. Containing Soviet communism required military bases worldwide, alliances spanning continents, economic aid programs, covert operations, and occasional military interventions, all justified as defense of freedom against totalitarian aggression yet functionally creating an informal empire. Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Chile, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, and dozens of other interventions demonstrated that Cold War struggle encompassed every continent and every form of conflict from nuclear brinkmanship to proxy wars to coups against democratically elected governments that threatened American interests. The moral ambiguity of Cold War actions troubled many Americans. Supporting dictators like the Shah of Iran, Mobutu in Zaire, or Pinochet in Chile contradicted American values but served anti-communist strategy, creating cognitive dissonance between American ideals and American actions that critics at home and abroad exploited. The Vietnam War particularly divided America, with millions questioning whether defending South Vietnamese dictatorship from communist dictatorship justified 58,000 American deaths and millions of Vietnamese casualties, whether American leaders had been truthful about war aims and progress, and whether Cold War containment doctrine made sense in every context regardless of local circumstances. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 left America as sole superpower, a unipolar moment of unchallenged dominance unprecedented in history. Never before had a single power been so relatively dominant militarily, economically, and culturally, and American policymakers spoke confidently of the end of history, permanent American leadership, indispensable nation status, and America's unique responsibility to spread democracy and free markets globally. Francis Fukuyama's thesis that liberal, democratic capitalism had won the ideological struggle definitively, that no viable alternative remained, that future history would be mere implementation details of universal values embodied in American system, captured the hubris of the moment. President George H.W. Bush proclaimed a new world order where international law and collective security would replace power politics, where the United Nations could finally function as intended now that Cold War divisions had ended, where American leadership would guide humanity toward peace and prosperity. The first Gulf War in 1991, with United Nations authorization and broad coalition including Arab states fighting to expel Iraq from Kuwait, seemed to validate this vision, demonstrating that overwhelming American power could be wielded for international law rather than narrow interests. Yet even during this moment of triumph, the patterns of decline were beginning to manifest, subtle at first but increasingly undeniable as the 21st century progressed. And the question became not whether America faced challenges but whether American political system could recognize and address them before they became insurmountable. Military overextension appeared almost immediately in the post-Cold War era as American forces found themselves engaged in missions for which they were poorly suited. Somalia in 1992 began as humanitarian mission to feed starving people but devolved into nation-building and counterinsurgency that ended in disaster when Somali militias shot down American helicopters and killed 18 soldiers, dragging bodies through Mogadishu streets in images that shocked Americans and made future interventions more difficult politically. The lesson seemed to be that American power had limits, that even weak opponents could inflict unacceptable casualties through asymmetric warfare, yet this lesson was repeatedly forgotten or ignored. The Balkans throughout the 1990s required American intervention to stop ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo, with NATO bombing campaigns that prevented genocide but also demonstrated that Europe remained unable to manage its own security without American leadership, 20 years after the Cold War ended. Peacekeeping forces remained in the Balkans for decades, tying down troops and resources for missions far removed from vital American interests, classic imperial overextension. The September 11th attacks in 2001 prompted wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that would cost trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, and create instability throughout the Middle East. The Afghanistan war began with legitimate purpose of destroying al-Qaeda and removing Taliban protection for terrorists, but mission creep transformed it into nation-building and counterinsurgency that continued for 20 years, becoming America's longest war, surpassing even Vietnam, ending in chaotic withdrawal in August 2021 that eerily echoed Britain's imperial retreats and Saigon's fall in 1975. The images of Afghans clinging to departing American aircraft, of Taliban fighters posing in captured American equipment, of the Kabul government collapsing within days of American withdrawal, demonstrated the ultimate futility of 2 decades of effort, the waste of lives and resources, the inability of American power to create stable governance in societies it didn't understand, and the limits of military force to achieve political objectives. Afghanistan will be remembered as one of history's great imperial failures, comparable to Rome in Teutoburg Forest or Britain in Afghanistan a century earlier. Iraq's invasion in 2003 represented an even greater strategic blunder, launched on false pretenses about weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, justified by inflated claims about connections to al-Qaeda that were minimal, rationalized by neoconservative ideology claiming that overthrowing Saddam Hussein would trigger democratic transformation throughout the Middle East. The invasion succeeded militarily within weeks, but the occupation that followed proved catastrophic. As sectarian violence erupted, insurgency spread, Iran gained influence, and American forces spent years fighting enemies created by the invasion itself. The costs of Iraq and Afghanistan together exceed $6 trillion when including long-term veterans' care and interest on borrowed money, consuming resources that might have been invested in infrastructure, education, research, or deficit reduction. The human costs include over 7,000 American dead and over 50,000 wounded, many with traumatic brain injuries or lost limbs requiring lifetime care, while civilian casualties in both countries number in the hundreds of thousands, creating grievances and instability that will persist for generations. Simultaneously with these wars, America maintained defense commitments to NATO allies facing potential Russian aggression, to Japan and South Korea facing North Korean threats and Chinese pressure, to Taiwan whose independence America implicitly guarantees, to Israel whose security America underwrites, to Gulf Arab states threatened by Iran, and to various other partners, creating scenarios where America could be drawn into conflicts from the Baltic to the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. The military, stretched thin across global commitments, faces recruitment challenges as fewer young Americans want military careers, aging equipment that requires replacement after 2 decades of hard use in desert warfare, and strategic confusion about priorities in an era where threats are diffuse and diverse. The Obama administration attempted a pivot to Asia, recognizing that China represented the long-term strategic challenge while the Middle East consumed resources disproportionate to its importance. But Middle Eastern commitments proved difficult to escape as Syria's civil war, ISIS's rise, and ongoing Afghanistan and Iraq operations demanded attention. The Trump administration questioned NATO's value and criticized allies for insufficient defense spending, creating uncertainty about American commitments while simultaneously escalating trade conflicts with China, withdrawing from international agreements, and pursuing transactional foreign policy that valued deals over alliances. The Biden administration attempted to refocus on China as primary competitor while managing withdrawal from Afghanistan and supporting Ukraine against Russian invasion. But the cumulative effect of decades of overextension is a military designed for peer conflict being used for counterinsurgency and nation building. It wasn't designed for creating readiness problems and exhaustion. Economic decline relative to competitors represents perhaps the most significant parallel to Rome and Britain. China's rise as manufacturing powerhouse and technological competitor represents the most significant challenge to American economic supremacy since the Soviet Union. But unlike the Soviets, whose command economy proved fundamentally flawed, China has adopted market mechanisms that make it far more formidable economically while maintaining authoritarian political control that allows long-term planning and resource mobilization impossible in democracies. Chinese GDP, measured by purchasing power parity, which accounts for different price levels, already exceeds America's, making China the world's largest economy by this metric. By nominal exchange rates, America remains larger, but the trend is clear and most projections show China surpassing America within the next decade or two, creating a situation where American economic dominance, taken for granted since World War II, ends. Chinese manufacturing output exceeds America's by wide margins. China produces more steel, aluminum, cars, ships, electronics, and most other manufactured goods than any other country, and much of what Americans consume is made in China, creating dependencies that give China leverage in any conflict. Chinese infrastructure investment dwarfs American spending. China builds high-speed rail networks spanning thousands of miles while America's rail remains outdated. China invests heavily in ports, airports, highways, and power grids while America's infrastructure crumbles from decades of underinvestment. And this infrastructure gap reflects different political systems' abilities to mobilize resources for long-term projects. Chinese technological achievements in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, renewable energy, electric vehicles, and telecommunications threaten American leadership in cutting-edge fields that will define economic competition in coming decades. Huawei's 5G technology leads globally despite American efforts to block it. Chinese electric vehicle companies like BYD produce millions of vehicles annually and dominate global markets except where politically blocked. Chinese AI companies like ByteDance create platforms like TikTok that compete with American social media, and Chinese renewable energy companies produce most of the world's solar panels and batteries, controlling supply chains essential for green energy transition. These achievements demonstrate that China is not merely catching up with American technology, but in some areas surpassing it, and American companies increasingly compete with rather than dominate Chinese rivals. American manufacturing, the arsenal of democracy that won World War II and dominated global production for decades after, has been hollowed out by decades of offshoring driven by pursuit of cheap labor and maximum profits. Factories closed, jobs moved to China and other low-wage countries. Supply chains became globalized and complex, creating efficiencies and lower consumer prices, but also strategic vulnerabilities and regional devastation. The Rust Belt's decline represents not just economic loss, but the COVID-19 pandemic exposed dangerous dependencies on Chinese manufacturing for critical goods. Personal protective equipment, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and other essential items were in short supply because production had moved to China, and China could threaten to withhold supplies, demonstrating that economic efficiency through globalization creates strategic vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit. Efforts to rebuild American manufacturing face enormous challenges, including higher labor costs, environmental regulations, and decades of lost expertise and infrastructure. American debt, approaching $35 trillion and growing rapidly, represents obligations that future generations may be unable or unwilling to service. Interest payments alone consume over $1 trillion annually, exceeding defense spending and growing as debt grows and interest rates rise, crowding out investments in infrastructure, education, research, and other priorities that could maintain American competitiveness. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not available for productive investment, and as baby boomers retire, Social Security and Medicare costs will explode, creating fiscal pressures that could force impossible choices between meeting obligations to seniors, maintaining military power, and investing in the future. The dollar's status as global reserve currency, analogous to the pound sterling's role in Britain's imperial heyday, gives America extraordinary advantages, including ability to print money that the world accepts as payment, run trade deficits that would destroy other currencies, and sanction other countries by excluding them from dollar-denominated transactions. But this status faces potential challenges. China promotes yuan internationalization, creating currency swap agreements and encouraging use of yuan in trade settlement. Digital currencies, including central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrencies, offer alternatives to dollar-dominated financial system, and growing resentment of American financial sanctions as weapons of foreign policy motivates some countries to seek alternatives. Losing reserve currency status would represent an economic catastrophe comparable to Britain's post-World War II austerity. America could no longer run large trade deficits. Import consumption would have to match export earnings. Interest rates would rise dramatically as foreign investors demand higher returns on assets denominated in depreciating currency. Living standards would fall, and the fiscal crisis would intensify as government finds it harder to borrow. This scenario remains unlikely. In near term, because no alternative matches the dollar's liquidity and safety, but trends are concerning, and what seems impossible can become inevitable faster than anyone expects. As Britain learned when pound sterling collapsed from reserve currency to ordinary currency within a generation. Trade deficits that have persisted for decades mean America consumes more than it produces, borrowing from abroad to finance consumption rather than investment, accumulating foreign debts that must eventually be serviced or defaulted on. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, giving it leverage over American fiscal policy and ability to disrupt American bond markets if relations deteriorate to open conflict, though doing so would damage China's own holdings, creating mutual vulnerability, sometimes called financial mutually assured destruction. Income inequality has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, creating an oligarchic class whose wealth dwarfs anything previous generations experienced. 3 Americans, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates at various times, possess more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans combined, and this concentration of resources in few hands mirrors Rome's senatorial class and Britain's aristocracy, breeding resentment, undermining social cohesion, and raising questions about whether American democracy can survive such inequality. The middle class, backbone of American prosperity and social stability since World War II, faces stagnation or decline, with younger generations expecting worse outcomes than their parents for the first time in American history, a reversal of the American dream that breeds cynicism and radicalism. Real wages for most workers have stagnated since the 1970s despite enormous increases in productivity, meaning workers produce more but don't share proportionally in gains, which instead flow to capital owners and top executives. CEO pay has exploded from 20 times average worker pay to over 300 times, a change that cannot be explained by market forces alone but reflects power imbalances and weakened labor organizations. Healthcare, education, and housing costs have outpaced wage growth dramatically, creating financial stress that affects political attitudes and life choices, with Americans working longer hours than citizens of other developed nations yet facing greater economic insecurity, medical bankruptcy, and inability to afford basics like healthcare and education that are public goods in other developed countries. Loss of political cohesion and shared purpose may be the most alarming parallel to previous empires because it undermines the ability to address other challenges. American politics has become tribal warfare where opposing parties view each other not as legitimate opponents but as existential threats to be defeated by any means necessary, where conspiracy theories flourish about stolen elections or deep state conspiracies, where basic facts are contested depending on political tribe, and where the peaceful transfer of power, foundation of democratic stability since Washington voluntarily surrendered power in 1797, can no longer be assumed automatic.